Hello, everyone. My name is Isabella Bryden, and the topic that I chose to do for my equity and inclusion area is disabilities as an educator. So the objectives of this presentation is to understand how to cultivate an inclusive workspace for educators with disability. Inclusion in the workplace is when employees feel valued, involved, and respected for the viewpoints, ideas, and perspectives and experiences that they bring to the table. So for people with disabilities, teachers with disabilities, we want to make sure that they feel like they are valued and well represented in the field of education. Um, what diversity and inclusion for teachers with disabilities would look like is clear recruitment policies, technology and resources that support teachers with physical disabilities, and then increasing opportunities for support and advocacy among teachers to share their experiences. Disabilities in the workplace, we're going to start with just the basic understanding of what a disability is. It is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities. So, my diversity component is educators who experience any form of physical or psychological disabilities. Some examples of this would be any teachers who are blind, deaf, autistic, wheelchair bound. Could be a teacher who has upper body mobility impairments or lower body impairments, visual impairments, cognitive impairments, or sometimes even speech. So if somebody has a hard time speaking, but they have all of the skills necessary, an example of a tool that might be good in that workplace would be text to speech so that they can provide their instruction without even having to say a word or even providing an interpreter. There have been copious efforts to improve equity in education for disabled students with our special education programs. However, we don't often put educators in front of them who reflect their abilities. And by that I mean, how often do we see teachers who have disabilities, unless it is a deaf teacher teaching ASL, which is American Sign Language, and often that's because they're the most fluent. So, if we put educators in front of them who represent the disabilities that our students are experiencing, it can represent their ability to achieve career success, or opportunities for them to learn successfully. It's crucial to provide inclusive education and equitable working conditions and resources for educators with disabilities. These could include advanced technology or support staff in the classrooms. Some current issues that we're facing in the field of education for disabled educators is, again, that lack of representation, not only in the field, but also in developing educational policy for students and teachers with disabilities, as well as resources for instruction or opportunities for career development. Oftentimes, there is no room for teachers with disabilities to progress. In fact, many teachers neglect to even disclose their disabilities if they are not physically or visually impaired as a means to prevent inhibiting their ability to progress in their career. If disabilities affect 1/4 of all American adults, as the CDC says, then that would mean over 1.3 million educators, from preschool teachers to post-secondary professors and instructors, could be disabled and in need of job accommodations and are not getting them and are not receiving the proper representation. Disabled educators experience barriers with career progression due to a lack of achievable pathways or being placed in disciplines that are seen as easier to instruct in order to avoid impairing the educator's ability to perform duties that are required of them. And this can go both ways. It could be well intended to provide adequate support to our teachers who are disabled, not wanting to provide overbearing workloads. However, it's also preventing them from demonstrating their abilities as educators and showing us that they can go above and beyond. We're restricting them under the guise of protecting them and providing equitable workspace. However, if we allow them to demonstrate their skill and their ability to perform well in more rigorous disciplines of education, it provides not only an opportunity for them to progress in their career, but also an opportunity for other people to get access to those careers as well. Universal design is design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. This is really key here when we're talking about creating a workplace environment that is inclusive for people with disabilities. Oftentimes, this comes um, into play when it's the physical environment. So we want to talk about a couple of different principles of universal design, such as equitable use, low physical effort, and simple and intuitive use, especially that low physical effort for people who are physically impaired. We want to make sure that all of their resources are within easy reach, so it's all at the same level. If somebody were in a wheelchair or if they were standing, we want to keep it right at that hip level. Um, or if we have technology that has resources and accessibility features, we want to make sure that our staff is um, well trained on how to use those resources. And that would mean that simple and intuitive use or equitable use. Designing schools for educators and students with disabilities comes into play here with universal design in terms of classroom training and our resources. So for classrooms, we want to make sure that that space, that physical space, is accessible and equitable for both students and teachers. And if we're designing that space for people with the lowest physical abilities, it also benefits people with more physical abilities. So we want those clear, wide pathways. We want to make sure that flooring is easily transitionable. So if there's any bumps or different textures that make it difficult for a wheelchair to move forward, it could also create tripping hazards for perfectly physically able people while walking, or even for students. We also want to make sure that those instructional materials are easy to reach and use, as I mentioned previously, and that there's a wide variety of instructional aids, such as if somebody is allergic to chalk, we want to provide whiteboards as well, or projectors, or even like walking pads so that we can roll those materials with us and provide different methods for instructors to be able to provide their lessons and instruct their disciplines as necessary for their teaching style and for their abilities. Our training, we want to make sure it's simple language so that everybody can understand it, no matter their cognitive ability or disability. We want to make sure that our expectations for roles and responsibilities are clear so that when a person is coming into their role and their career, they know what is expected of them and they know that they can meet those requirements. We also want to make sure that in our training, we are ensuring that every single staff member has solidified comprehension of how to use all of the tools that are available to them. So that way, if one teacher has to step away and another steps in, they know how to use those as well, regardless of their ability. We also want to make sure that we are providing resources such as classroom staff aids or up-to-date accessibility technology like text-to-speech or speech-to-text or visual aids. So sometimes people who are deaf use lights as notifications or as a method of like raising hands because they can't rely on their ears to be able to like notice a shift in movement. If somebody's clothes are rubbing up against each other, that can often be an audio cue for us without us even realizing it. But teachers who are deaf, they often have to look up more frequently, scan the classroom. So sometimes those visual aids of like bright flashing lights can help a deaf instructor be able to support their students in a better way. Also, their colleagues should have an understanding of what that disabled educator needs help with and what resources are available to them so that they can provide support as necessary to their peers. Some advocacy for disabled educators comes from three educators worldwide. We have Esther Mbite, who is a blind primary school teacher advocating for classroom innovations, like we just talked about previously. We also have Chipilicano Balakir and Gloop, and I'm sorry if I butchered that. They are mobily impaired in both of their legs, and they often advocate for student-centered teaching by celebrating diversity. And then we have Esther Vico, who is mobily impaired in their upper body and advocates for accessible learning materials. And these are all active teachers who are teaching in different countries, different parts of the world, and experience disabilities and also demonstrate advocacy practices for their fellow disabled educators and their students, which is super crucial because if we're advocating for students, we should be advocating for educators and vice versa. A lot of teachers also believe that it's important for people with disabilities to self-advocate because it can be helpful in gaining accommodations and support from other staff. This is a topic that is unfortunately very underrepresented. We have finding resources on teachers who have disabilities is very difficult. It's not something that we see very often, and we want to get more advocacy practices going, and we want to see more representation of disabled educators in the education field. So the key takeaways from this presentation is that in a field as impactful as education, showing our students the ability to overcome obstacles is critical for their development and success. It shapes their mindsets for achievement, their perception of their peers, and their skills for perseverance, showing our students that people who experience challenges in any way, shape, or form, whether that's physical, cognitive, or just life struggles in general, you can overcome that. You can still be successful. And if you have a dream, you can go out and chase it. And for youth, it's crucial that we show them that because they are in a critical stage of their development. A person's physical or cognitive ability doesn't impact or determine their skills for teaching or their intelligence. And it's our job as fellow educators to advocate for equitable use and inclusive work environments for all teachers, regardless of our abilities or disabilities. We need better resources and representation for teachers with disabilities to ensure equitable and inclusive education for our students. I've mentioned it a couple of times, but if we want a inclusive and equitable education for our students, we have to make sure that our educators are getting all of the support that they need to be able to provide the best education possible. I've provided a couple different resources. These are all links that go to either websites that talk about resources that are available for educators, discussing what education with disabilities look like, and also just learning more about people with disabilities in general to overcome those implicit biases. These are my references, and thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I appreciate your time.